Hello everyone, this is Ishan and you are watching Programming with Ishan. Welcome to the second chapter of our Angular project. And because you have made it this far, I'm guessing you already would have done the Angular setup completely on your devices. Also, you would have created the first Angular project which we discussed in our first chapter. If so, great job guys. If no, please do that before proceeding ahead. It will be helping you all out for further learning. Coming to this chapter, we will kick things off exploring the differences between MPA versus SPA, that is multi-page application versus single-page application, and then we will take a closer look at the architecture of our Angular framework, that is like the backbone of our Angular project, and finally we will be discussing the file structure of the Angular project so that you can understand and work with your workspace like a pro. So without any further ado, let's get started. MPA versus SPA. To understand these two and their differences, let's take a real world example. Consider there is a shop, a fruit shop owned by a guy named Mr. Frontend and a storage house owned by a guy named Mr. Backend. So Mr. Frontend is having this unique way of selling his fruits to his customers, wherein every time a customer visits and requests for a fruit to Mr. Frontend calls Mr. Backend at that time itself and asks for that fruit to be delivered. So if a customer enters the shop and asks for a watermelon, Mr. Frontend makes a call to Mr. Backend for that watermelon to be delivered. And Mr. Backend sends someone with the watermelon for that fruit to be delivered to Mr. Frontend's shop. The same process keeps on repeating for every customer's request. If you change this whole scenario with a web application structure, your web application behaves like a multi-page application. So to visualize it better, just replace the watermelons with the HTML template, the customer with the user, front end, back end, and the customer's request as an event triggered on the front end application, which tries to call an API to get the HTML template that should be rendered on the front end, so for the user to see it. So this whole thing is MPA. So now let's discuss about single page applications with the same scenario. Here Mr. Frontend is having a different approach to sell his fruits. Mr. Frontend is going to connect with Mr. Backend only once in the beginning of the day for the purpose of getting the fruits. So it will call Mr. Frontend and get all the fruits available in the menu at the beginning of the day itself and get it delivered so that he himself can serve every customer's request rather than connecting with Mr. Backend to get a fruit delivered every time a request comes in. So this same scenario, if you apply to your web application, it will start behaving as a single page application. But there is a catch, okay? The front end will still connect with Mr. Backend if Mr. Frontend needs some kind of data. So like the count of oranges or counts of fruits available, such kind of data if it is required from Mr. Frontend, in that case also it will connect with Mr. Backend. Now to visualize that in terms of the web application, let's have this as front-end application, this one is back-end application. Let's have a user who tries to create an event or trigger an event, and then the response which is coming from the backend, let's look into that. So whenever a front end is loaded the first time, it tries to make a request to Mr. Backend, our backend application, and backend application will actually send or respond back to the front end application with a single HTML file and a list of few JavaScript framework files, which is required by the front end application to behave as a single page application. Now for every triggered event which is coming from a user, for example a button click or a page navigation change, front end itself will handle the navigation on its own part. It will only connect with the backend again if a new data is required. For example, if you want to show some user data or some user list, in such cases front end will call backend again and get that data as a JSON data structure, okay, and it will consume that data. So this whole structure is your single page application structure. Now to understand the differences and the definitions theoretically, I am writing them out on the screen. You can pause the video for a while and go through them before going to the next section. Before diving deeper into the Angular application architecture, let's first discuss about the architectural patterns. These architectural patterns actually serves as proven solutions for your common software architecture design problems, as well as they provide a very structured approach for your component organization, their interaction, and the behavior. Let's discuss few of the key features of these architectural patterns. Wherein the first one is the segregation of concerns. So they help to divide your application into multiple components, and each component is responsible for a separate concern, like they have their own responsibility. So that actually is very helpful for the purpose of maintainability of the whole process. Second comes the scalability. So architectural pattern actually ensures that the system can handle increasing complexity and load. And as we discussed, they help the system to be very reusable and maintainable. Plus the standardization and communication part, that is like if you're using a well-known architecture in your application, then most of the team are aware of it, so you don't need to explain it to everyone. Plus they can share their ideas effectively because they have common ground. Then comes the flexibility and extensibility. So it helps to make your application very flexible and adhere to any new changes which is going to come. Helps to enhance the performance, plus also improves the security. And then comes the facilitation of team collaboration. So as we discussed in our previous point, it helps for the standardization and communication. So in turn, it helps the team collaboration a lot. So these are the key uses of your architectural pattern. So now let's talk about the two architectural patterns that actually Angular relates to a lot. That is your MVC and MVVM. MVC stands for a model view controller. And this pattern helps your application to divide in three interconnected components, that is model, view, and container. And to understand the linkage between all these three, let's try to see this with an example where a user wants to get some data from database and present the same on the screen in a presentable format. So for that purpose, user first clicks on pages button, which will send a request to the server and get that data. So when the request goes to the server, the first thing it interacts with is the controller. Now the controller is having this ability to manage the requests flow. It cannot manage the data, or it cannot do the logic part, but it can manage the request flow. And because it cannot manage the data, so to fetch the data from database, it tries to take help from this second component, that is your model. So model is responsible for the purpose of interaction with the database, as well as it manages the data logic part also. So once it receives the data from the database, it sends it back to the controller. Controller gets it into a raw format, and it cannot send it back to the user because user would like to get it in a presentable format. So what it does is it sends the data to the view, where it gets converted to a presentable format. And this format can be considered as a template, like an HTML template, which gets back to the user via a HTTP response. So either the view can directly send it to the user using an HTTP response, or else it sends that template to the controller, and controller sends that response back to our user, so that it can be presented on his screen or rendered on his screen. So let's try to understand MVVM, that is model view model architecture, widely used in front-end frameworks like AngularJS and Knockout.js. So here, say the user is trying to interact with the view. User goes ahead and clicks a button on the view for fetching some data from the database. So once the button is clicked, that event gets handled by the view model. View model is actually serving as a binding layer between the model and the view part. Model and view do not connect directly. View model is the one which tries to get the data from model and pass it to the view, and get the request from the view and pass it to the model. Okay. So once the view model gets that event, it passes that request to the model, and it is the responsibility of the model to either return some data which is required by the view model, or else if the data is required from the database, in that case it tries to connect with the server by calling this API available, and server connects with the database, fetches the data and passes it back to the model in a JSON data response format. Now once the model receives that data, it returns it back to the view model, and view model is actually having this binding with the view that is called as a two-way data binding. This means that any change which happens on the view model gets reflected on the view and vice versa. So once the view model receives the latest data which model got from the API call, it gets represented on the view, as view is the presentation layer and it is responsible for dynamically rendering the data and showing it to the user. Finally, user gets to see that data. So this is what MVVM architectural pattern does. And coming to the Angular, so there would be a question that where exactly the Angular fits in these two. Angular actually is having its architecture as a component based architecture. You cannot call Angular to be a MVVM. You cannot call Angular to be completely a MVC. It takes the best of both of them and utilizes them in the best way possible. Thank you for watching this video, guys. If you really enjoyed this, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe to our channel for more updates. Also, let's meet in the second part of this chapter for discussing the topics like the core building blocks of Angular, data binding mechanisms, change detection, as well as the file structure.